Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have three members who are scheduled to speak. So at this time, I would like to recognize Representative Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Strickland. Mr. Flynn, in your testimony, you laid out 4 corridors in Amtrak's national network that received significant investments from the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, several of which run right through Chicago. Can you share with the committee what kind of further improvements we can anticipate with the type of investment proposed in President Biden's American Jobs Plan? And would Amtrak consider additional improvement in corridors that run through the Chicagoland area?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Garcia. Let me start with the last part of your question as to whether Amtrak would consider additional investment. The answer is absolutely yes. And our Amtrak Connects Us strategy, which talks about new corridor services and expanded corridor services, it addresses exactly that. And certainly Chicago is a key component, a key node in the Amtrak network. So that's about expanding services from Chicago into Madison and Milwaukee. We're talking about expanding, that's our Hiawatha service, expanding to multiple daily services through to Minneapolis, St. Paul. To Congressman Davis, we're talking about expansions from Chicago into St. Louis on those several lines, the ability to connect to Detroit, Michigan, and points in between. So Chicago is a very important part of our network, as you know, and certainly a key part of our vision of how we can expand more rail services on routes that we have today and new passenger routes that we have yet to serve.
And you wrote at length in your written testimony about why the U.S. has fallen so far behind in high-speed rail connectivity. You also mentioned how existing funding programs like CRISI, the RAISE program, which we previously knew as the Tiger or Build, in your words, existing funding streams, quote, wouldn't even make a dent in the construction of a single high-speed rail line. What are some policy solutions the committee should consider to make sure an adequate source of funding exists to begin to build a framework for a high-speed rail network? And does intercity rail need its own dedicated funding stream?
Well, the answer to your question, Congressman Garcia, is in your statement. At the beginning of our hearing today, before the first panel spoke, Chairman DeFazio talked about funding, talked about the need for transportation infrastructure. One of the other witnesses, former Deputy Secretary Pocari, talked about funding and talked about the need for a trust fund structure or a trust fund-like structure so that we can have dedicated, predictable funding for these kinds of projects that are going to occur over a very long period of time. When we think about NEPA and the other permitting processes that take place, and then ultimately into construction, on many major projects, we're talking a decade or more. So without the visibility and the predictability and the certainty of funding, these projects are all affected. They ultimately become more high cost, and they take longer than they should. So if I were to recommend one policy action, creating a trust fund or trust fund-like structure for intercity passenger rail would be key.
Thank you. And finally, before our time runs out, you discussed the reduction in greenhouse gases when the Northeast Corridor was largely electrified. Are there other corridors in the country that would be strong candidates for electrification? What kind of market and policy obstacles remain in further electrification of our intercity passenger rail network?
Yeah, there certainly are other corridors that would lend themselves to electrification. There'll be requirements for density of service and key population centers. I talked earlier about our new intercity train sets that we have. We're placing an order for, finalizing that order. Those intercity train sets are dual mode, so the locomotive can go from electric to diesel, and a much more fuel efficient diesel in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that are created per passenger mile by those diesels. So there are interim steps that advance us along the president's goal to that 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. And passenger rail certainly is one of those vehicles to provide the mobility the country needs, but to do it in the most environmentally sustainable way. Thank you,
Great.
sir.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to recognize Representative LaMalfa